with regard to the response from the U.S. to the ICJ's ruling, I mean, it's just they continue to completely gaslight about what the International Court of Justice even said. Let's take a listen to this. Is John Kirby, who has, really won some awards here in terms of his shameless level of propaganda, getting asked about that ruling and the U.S. response. Let's take a listen to some of that.
Our disagreement over the founding claim of the allegation causes any permanent damage to the bilateral relationship with South Africa. We just happen to disagree on that point. But we're also going to keep working on that relationship as we do many others.
So you fundamentally believe the U.S., they claim that the U.S. is supporting a genocidal state. That is not going to impact relations with South Africa.
I don't believe I heard that from South Africa. South Africa filed a case based on allegations that they believe genocide was being conducted by Israel in Gaza. I don't believe it was directed at us at all. We simply have said consistently we find that claim is unfounded. And the court also did not find Israel guilty of genocide.
The court did not find Israel guilty of genocide, he says there, which is incredible gaslighting because they were not ruling on the merits at this point, something he surely knows. Mm-hmm. That decision will take years of evaluating the evidence. However, in that ruling, which I read every word of, they basically sided with South Africa on every critical claim, including citing some specific language of top Israeli officials, including President Herzog, as being potential incitement to genocide. And so, even though the U.S. is not directly named in this case at the ICJ, it's very clear our direct complicity, which creates, let's just put it mildly, some challenges for U.S. officials and certainly for, propaganda spin masters like John Kirby in terms of how we approach it. Because this is an administration, Saagar, as you know, that has loved to talk a big game about the quote unquote international rules of, international rules-based order when it serves their interests and when it goes against the baddie countries like Russia that we don't like. But suddenly we see, not that this was any surprise and not that we've been, consistent in the past, but there is a giant Israel-shaped exception to any sort of international rules-based order as backed by the United States of America.
Yeah, I mean, they pushed it against Putin. They're like, oh, we want to make him an international pariah. And now all of that is completely out the window. It is embarrassing for them, almost certainly. And you're right, in terms of the way that they parse the language. They want international institutions to be convenient for their foreign policy whenever it aligns, but then disregard it. It's like, guys, that's not how it's supposed to work. Like, you either agree or not, especially in this case because the U.S. is party to the ICJ. But yeah, Ryan did a great job, by the way, for breaking it down for everybody with Truth to Parsi, the actual thing. I encourage people to go watch that if you're interested in the details. Any last thoughts on the ICJ, Krystal, before we go on to Pelosi?
Yeah, the last thing I'll say is it's interesting the way that the U.S. media spun the ICJ ruling, because I think you and I both, and I'd be curious your thoughts as well. When we first were reading the U.S. media reports before we actually could read the text of the ruling, I was like, and I tried to, sort of like have it both ways. Kind of a win for Israel. It's kind of a win for South Africa. They're clearly, politically trying to maintain their legitimacy. When I actually read through the text, of course, I wanted to see them go further and call for a full and complete ceasefire, but it was a much more dramatic loss for Israel than I would have thought based on the U.S. media reports. Because as I said, as they go through claim by claim from South Africa, I mean, first of all, on all the technical legal matters, do they have standing? Is there a dispute, et cetera? They agree with South Africa. In terms of concern for the humanitarian situation and buying Israel's BS about, we're shipping in plenty of aid, et cetera, they don't buy that. And then as I mentioned, they cite specific comments from Yoav Gallant, the defense minister, the ones about, it's a siege, we're dealing with human animals, we'll treat them as such, those comments from him. They cite the words of Israeli President Isaac Herzog saying there are no uninvolved civilians. And they cite another Israeli minister in a post that he put on Twitter that hadn't even really come to my attention before, but also spoke to the sort of complete siege conditions that they were subjecting all Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to. So as you go through, it seems very much that they gave a lot more credence to the South African side. And for them to say, yes, we do believe plausibly that these conditions could be contributing to genocide. I saw one analysis that said it would be difficult for them to call for a ceasefire because they have no power over Hamas. Hamas isn't a state actor. They're not party to the ICJ and the Genocide Convention. So all they can do is compel Israeli actions. And they're telling them to stop all of the things that are creating these conditions of plausible genocide. So it does go a bit further than I initially thought based on the media reports. And the other thing is Netanyahu is clearly furious about the ruling and attacked it in all the ways you would think. It's anti-Semitic, blah, blah, blah. But also, as they move forward, if they continue to prosecute this war in this fashion, they do find themselves at risk of it'll take a while, years down the road, but actually having been found to be committing genocide. The last thing that, Saagar, I found incredibly significant is just how nearly unanimous it was. There is no way in hell I thought the American judge was going to go along with a ruling like this. No way in hell. You even had the Israeli ad hoc judge that they chose going along with pieces of this ruling. And there was just one judge from Uganda, which I don't know what was going on with her, but who objected to the whole thing. Everybody else was pretty much unanimous. So that's the other reason I thought this was actually quite significant, because I figured they'd just play politics. I figured they'd find some technical loophole. Like I said, there's no way I thought the American judge would go along with a ruling saying, yes, they're plausibly committing genocide, but that's exactly what we saw. So it actually is kind of astonishing.
Yeah, I actually agree with that. I actually thought that the ruling was good because what the ruling did is it said that war is acceptable. We are not going to call on the ability to not wage war. What we're saying is that the way you are waging war is contravening to the articles that we have under the ICJ, and they cite specific instances. And they also were like, you can continue to conduct war. It falls in line with the general theory of you have a right to self-defense, you have a right to go after people who have attacked you, but that there are lines within that, the general conduct of nations that are party to the ICJ. And then let's even take the ICJ out of it and just see the general Western consensus whenever you have a advanced Western-style military that's going after a paramilitary group, a terrorist organization, or insurgent group, in the way that you could even compare how different Israel's military response has been from the way that the United States conducted itself during the counterinsurgency campaign in Iraq and Afghanistan. Just the level of care for humanitarian, for civilians and others. I'm not going to say we're perfect, but I think you could compare the two and say they're dramatically different. My point only just being there that what the ICJ ruling said is you have a right to conduct war. You have a right to defend yourself. The way that you have done this, combined with the statements of many of your gubernatorial ministers, has been such that it seems you plausibly could be committing ethnic cleansing and or genocide. And so if you want to avoid such charges, you should change the way that you conduct the war. So in that, I generally believe international law and all that is fake because, as you said, how can they enforce it? Also, Hamas is a non-governmental organization. It's a non-state actor. It literally is not party to any of this. So any of it doesn't matter per se. But if we understand it just in the way that Western militaries behave and have behaved in the post-World War II era, and such that ICJ, Geneva Conventions, and all of those were agreed upon amongst each other about this is kind of the way that we're going to conduct war. Yes, total war is a different story like we were used to be in, and if we ever find ourselves in one such again, then there probably won't be abiding this. But within this general framework, this is how we act, and it's how the U.S., held the Russian military, for example, to this standard whenever they were conducting war in Ukraine. Then we can see clearly this is outside of that realm. So within that, I thought it was actually quite of a good ruling. And I also think, to bolster what you said, Krystal, is that this is going to dramatically increase pressure for that ceasefire, because Netanyahu and the rest of the Israeli public are not stupid. They are a small country. They rely upon the behest of international trade. And if you reduce the amount of international trade that you're able to conduct, and you've got all these great technology companies in Tel Aviv and all that, you got to sell it to somebody. You got to license it to somebody. That's largely the backbone of the entire Israeli economy, on top of all of the imports that make Tel Aviv and Israel function as a nation state. If you reduce that even by 15%, imagine if the U.S. economy contracted by 15% or our imports went down by 50%. It'd be a catastrophe for the way that we live our overall life. I think this will dramatically increase pressure for a 2-month ceasefire. I talked about it a bit last time with Ryan too, and I was like, look, I think, at this stage in the game, especially given the inability for them so far to achieve their military aims and others, if the guns stop firing for 2 months, it is very likely they're not turning on in the same way again. I'm not going to say there will be no military action, but the same way that they conduct themselves, just given the amount of international pressure and the sigh of relief from the West and others, and the eventual pressure that would build up to that point, it's extraordinarily unlikely that they could continue. But maybe that's why they don't want to agree. They just want to muscle through and just keep going. I'm not sure what they're going to do.
I'm not sure either. Just a couple more points on that. I thought Ryan made a really good point about the no enforcement mechanism piece, which is true, which we've said a number of times, which is accurate. But I mean, it's the same thing as our Supreme Court doesn't have an enforcement mechanism, which is kind of a live issue right now with what's going on at the border. But the reason it has power is because people give it credence and power. And so that's the whole idea of legitimacy of the ICJ and these other international bodies is, do people pay attention to the rulings? Do they abide by them, or do they thumb their nose? Because if the US and our European allies and Israel thumbs our nose and says, okay, you think that they're plausibly committing genocide and you compelled them, to do all these certain things to prevent those conditions. And also, by the way, to go after some of these ministers who are inciting genocide. If we just say no, then there's no enforcement mechanism, there's no legitimacy. It's the exact same thing with our Supreme Court. The thing that gives it legitimacy is that we all agree it has legitimacy and we pay attention to its rulings. So I think it's important to keep that in mind with regard to the quote unquote lack of enforcement mechanism. There's going to be a UN Security Council likely vote on this week. We'll see what the U.S. does, but everybody should be incredibly discouraged by the fact that our immediate reaction was to cut the very aid that the ICJ says should be increasing. Our response was, how about we cut the funding and actually decrease the amount of humanitarian assistance to Palestinians in this moment of absolute crisis? And then the last thing two other things. Russia was sort of set up. They had sort of planned the contingency plan for, if we become a pariah state, we'll have our economy and our government set up to be able to deal with that. And, alternative world powers, including, a close relationship with China, to be able to cope with that. And so it hasn't been painless, but they've been able to get through it. Israel is not set up like that. Israel is incredibly dependent on foreign direct investment, on capital flowing into the country. They're very dependent on this global tech sector, which is really both a source of economic prosperity and also incredible national pride. So they are not prepared economically to be that pariah state. And the last thing I will say on this is, the U.S., we pick and choose when we feel like listening to international law, when we don't. We have been complete hypocrites on this basically since the beginning. We just decide when and how we're going to pay attention to this. But Europe has approached this in a more consistent way. And so it will be a much more difficult thing for the EU and the constituent European nations to go against what the ICJ is saying here and what they continue to say going forward, because this isn't over. They will also be assessing whether Israel is meeting their obligations that have now been set forth by the International Court of Justice. So, and the EU is a huge trading partner it's one of their top trading partners for Israel. So the stakes do exist. It's not nothing. And I think you could already see in some Israeli actions the way that this has mattered.
Hey guys, if you like that video, go to breakingpoints.com, become a premium subscriber, and help us build the best independent media organization on the planet.
That's right. We're subscriber funded. We're building something new. We want to replace these failing mainstream media organizations.
So again, to subscribe, it's breakingpoints.com.